Hey, welcome in everyone to the week 2 edition of the GLIAC football podcast on d2football.com. Thanks for joining me, gang. It's Tony Nicolette alongside going through what we've got coming up here in week 2. Another week full of non-conference games as we work our way towards the GLIAC slate that'll kick off here later this month. GLIAC had a bit of a rough week in week 1, going 3-3 against non-conference competition. All those games against D2 foes. A little bit, not quite what we were hoping for. Hoping to get something a little bit closer to maybe 4-2 or 5-1, but we'll see what the lads can do this week as they take on another round of opponents, and we'll see how things fare as we work our way through week 2 of the GLIAC football season. And that week 2 kicks off in Caledonia, just outside of Grand Rapids on the southeast end of things, as Davenport will host Bowie State from Bowie, Maryland. The Panthers got off to a good start last week against Thomas More with a 31-17 victory. Thomas More, probably not the highest end opponent on the Davenport slate, but the Panthers handled things pretty well. They got off to a 24-0 halftime lead and kind of cruised from there to a 31-17 final. 358 yards of total offense for Davenport, so nothing particularly overwhelming there. A great game for Jason Whitaker at quarterback for the Panthers, 276 yards through the air, accounted for all 4 of the Panther touchdowns on the afternoon. So it really kind of was an easy victory for them. Nothing too particular taxing or what have you, against Thomas More. Now, Bowie State comes in after a pretty disappointing 2022. They were, I believe, an NCAA quarterfinalist in 2021. So last year's result really wasn't all that great, not even close to being in playoff contention. But they did find a way to knock off an FCS opponent back in week 1. Beating Delaware State. They employed most of the quarterback work was done by Amir Jenkins, 247 yards passing, and he did a little bit of running as well with 9 carries. So he's going to probably be the key catalyst for the Bulldogs on offense. But the Bulldog defense was stellar against Delaware State. Only giving up a grand total of 196 yards on the day. So, Davenport's probably going to face a little bit tougher test here in this one in terms of what type of caliber of defense that they're going to play versus what they saw against Thomas More. So, obviously, we all kind of know the old coaching adage that offenses make their biggest improvement between weeks 1 and weeks 2. So I think Davenport's going to be keying on that here, as they had a solid week last week, but they should be able to work some of the kinks out. Myron Harris led the rushing attack in his first game for Davenport, so I'm sure the Panthers are going to look for that to continue, but they also kind of broke in a couple of new receivers. Even though Preston Smith came back off his injury and had a great game, we did see a couple of new pass catchers for Davenport that started to get their timing and rhythm going with Whitaker. So we should see the Davenport Panthers be in a good shape to be really competitive here against Bowie State. This is actually a really interesting game, so much so that our pal Chris Ferguson, the CIAA columnist, is actually going to make his way north to check this one out. So be interesting to see how well the Panthers are in terms of hospitality towards all of their guests that come up to Grand Rapids area and pay a visit here this Saturday. So the next game is up in Houghton as Michigan Tech actually kicks off their season. They had the week 1 as an open date, and they'll play Hillsdale. It's a traditional GLIAC rivalry. Those two teams always kind of mirrored each other in terms of their style of play and the types of offense that they ran. I believe I even mentioned in my season opening column earlier this year that Dan Matlack was the quarterback coach at Hillsdale the last time that the Chargers won the GLIAC back in 2011. So Matlack opens his coaching tenure at Michigan Tech this weekend, and they get to do it at home. I think they call it Kearley Stadium now. It's going to be tough. Old guys like me, it's always going to be Sherman Field. So old habits are hard to break, I suppose. So, while Metlock may have been a great quarterback in his day and has done a lot of quarterback coaching, he's going to have a brand new signal caller running things for the Huskies this year. All signs point to Alex Freeze is going to be the guy. And so he's going to be tasked with obviously keeping the Husky offense on schedule, making sure that he limits turnovers, gets them into the right alignments and the right calls. He's going to have a lot of help in terms of his receiving core. All the top receivers from last year are back, and Brandon Michalak, Ethan Champion, of course, all GLIAC performer Darius Willis. So he's going to have a lot of help on the outside. And this could bode well for Tech because Hillsdale in their week 1 tussle with another former GLIAC foe, Indianapolis, the Chargers really had a tough time stopping the pass. The Greyhounds threw for 320 yards on the afternoon. Gavin Sukup, the Greyhound quarterback, had 3 touchdown passes with a long at 78 yards. So Hillsdale had a little bit of a tough time stopping the pass game last week. And so if there's an Achilles heel early in the season for Hillsdale, it looks like it might be the pass. And so we could see, Tech try to air it out just a little bit more. Now, Tech doesn't throw the ball deep as regularly as they do try to hit you with a lot of RPO and a lot of quick hits and getting guys the ball in space. But we could see a bit of a mix here. It's kind of a Pandora's box that could get open here because you just really don't know what Dan Metlack's going to do, given that this is his first head coaching stint. So, things could look like a lot like they did last year. They could be all over the place. So it'll be really interesting to see. Now, I'm actually excited to watch the Tech defense and see how they perform in this one. Hillsdale is primarily a run-first team. Mike Herzog comes in after a great game against Indianapolis last week. So again, we talked about the guys like Mark Sipple, being a great GLIAC player who had an awesome season last year, was one of the top tacklers in the country. He returns. And then, of course, getting that defensive lineman back whose name is escaping me, and I apologize to Tech fans for not having him on the tip of my tongue. Sorry, guys. I'm drawing a blank. Hanny. This is the first time I've had a real big mix-up on this podcast, so everybody's going to have to hang in there with me and forgive me. So I know he missed last year, and I'm drawing a blank on his name. So Tech fans, you can chastise me as need be, but it'll be interesting to see. Again, I think Tech's defense actually, again with Sipple leading the charge. And, also having guys like, Austin Schlicht back in the fold. It's going to be an interesting year for Tech because I think, again, they're going to have to lean on their defense as their offense kind of starts to figure things out with a new starting quarterback. This is going to be a good game, and it was a very good game last year. Tech's actually won 4 of the last 5 in this series and went down to Hillsdale and knocked them off after Hillsdale had just beaten undefeated Ashland the week before. So this is a pretty good rivalry. I'm glad that these two teams are keeping it going. It should be a really interesting game, and we're looking forward to seeing what the results are from this one. So now we move over to Detroit, the jewel of the lodge, as it were, and we're going to see Wayne State, who dropped their season opener last week at Slippery Rock. Played the Pride pretty close, but didn't move the ball particularly well. So I think, with Tyrone Wheatley's first games running his offense and what he wants to do, it's going to take a little bit of time for Wayne State to try to figure some things out. We saw a split at the quarterback between Jaden Waddle and Eli McLean. So not sure exactly what we're going to see heading into this one. It was only 13 total pass attempts for Wayne last week. They really did try to run the ball as much as they could, 50 total attempts. And both those quarterbacks actually contributed quite a bit to the carry totals, with Waddle actually leading the team with 14. So it's going to be a run-first approach, it looks like, for Wayne State this year. And it'll be interesting to see, how well they can attack Missouri S&T, who, pretty much got destroyed last week by Delta State, which, Delta State's a ranked team out of the Gulf South, high caliber outfit with a really great senior quarterback in Patrick Shegog. And S&T just had no answer for the big play capability of the Statesmen. All 6 of Delta State's touchdowns last week came on drives that took 5 plays or less. So things were really quick strike. It was big plays that hurt S&T. So obviously Wayne's going to look to see what they can do to generate some big plays, because it seems like there are some openings to be had in the Miners defense. Now, again, whether they can do that through the run or the pass is going to be interesting to watch. But I actually like, Wayne to find a way to keep them, Wayne's defense to keep themselves in the game here. Slippery Rock, despite having a pretty potent offense last year, only threw for 138 yards in this one. They kind of didn't have to do much because they ran the ball pretty well. But, for an offense that's kind of reputed to be high powered, and they only put together 347 yards total, that's not a massive amount. They did lead pretty much throughout, but again, they didn't really overwhelm Wayne State. And so if the Wayne defense can fare much better against S&T, the offense might be able to figure some things out here in week 2. Tyler Gioia is the quarterback for Missouri S&T, and not only does he lead the team in the passing attack, but he was their leading rusher last week. 14 carries for 84 yards and a score. So that's going to be the job one of that Wayne State defense, is trying to slow him down. But again, I think if they can, Wayne's got a real good shot to get off the schneid here and get themselves a week 2 win and open up their home season with a victory. So hopefully they can get Coach Wheatley his first victory as the Wayne head coach, and get the Warriors on the right track here moving into the next part of the season. So the next stop is up into Marquette, and we'll see Northern Michigan host Lake Erie. So Northern Michigan, had a bit of a rough go of it last year. Things didn't go quite as well as they were hoping for, and yet they still had a pretty convincing win over Lake Erie to close out the season. So this is a team that any of the holdovers that are still with the Wildcats, they've seen them and they know they can beat them. So Mariano Valenti had his first start last week against Minnesota Duluth. The Wildcats suffered a 47-10 loss in Duluth, which, Duluth is a traditional power within the NSIC, so not necessarily super surprising that the Bulldogs came out and played a solid game. And then just so many new parts at Northern, it's going to take them a little bit of time to kind of get things rolling the way they want. And so, this might be a game that kind of cures what ails them. Again, let's make that week 1 to week 2 jump, and then you get a Lake Erie Storm team that, really struggled last week in their opener, losing to Franklin Pierce 26-10, and Franklin Pierce was a 2-8 team a year ago. So, to drop a game to a team that really wasn't all that solid last year in such a convincing fashion, that does not bode well for what Lake Erie's bringing into this game. They completed far less than 50% of their passes last week. Ran the ball with a certain amount of efficiency, but again, to lose to a team out of the Northeast 10 that didn't have a great record last year, this is a Lake Erie team that's beatable. And so I think you're going to see Tyquan Cox probably have another strong game. He didn't average a lot in terms of his per carry last week against Duluth, but he kind of kept banging at it. And, I think you're going to see him get a lot of carries again, and Valenti will probably do quite a bit of the workload as well in the rushing attack. And we'll see if the Wildcats can get themselves a win. But I think this is a good spot for Northern. So again, Lake Erie's got to make that long trip up to Marquette, and they're coming off a tough game where they just did not play well against an inferior opponent. So this looks like a game that Northern should be the favorite. All right, so now as we move through the day, Saturday, and we get towards the evening, we're now into a spot where we start getting into some more interesting games, especially in terms of rivalry. So we open up here now at 6 p.m. with Northwood making the trip over to University Center to take on Saginaw Valley. So back during the GLIAC days, this was a massive rivalry, and it still is, just due to proximity. And I believe that the two teams still dub this game as the Axe Bowl. So it's a trophy game, and it's one that these two teams take really seriously. And over the years of covering the GLIAC, it's always been amazing how often one of the teams might be a little bit down. And I've seen it where, Saginaw's been down and Northwood's been down, and this game still seems to bring out the best in both teams. And I know I picked it wrong many times when I was writing my column back in the late aughts and early teens. So this is one of those throw out the records games under normal circumstances. I think as we head into the 2023 edition, boy, I don't know. I got a hard time seeing this not being a one-sided affair. So, Northwood played Glenville State last week, suffered a 44-9 loss at home to the Pioneers, and it was not a good outing for Northwood. 190 yards of total offense is just I hate to use this adjective, but that's an anemic performance, an anemic output. 5 turnovers to go along with it, and to make matters, horribly worse, 3 of those turnovers got returned for touchdowns by Glenville State. So Glenville's offense was okay; it was serviceable, but they didn't have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting because the defense scored 3 times for them. So I suppose the silver lining for Northwood coming into this one is that maybe it couldn't get any worse. But gosh, to go into hostile environment against an arch rival and a team that's coming off a 34-24 victory over playoff opponent from last year, Winona State, the Cardinals are in solid shape. Now, there is a bit of a question mark as we head into this one, is I don't know what the health is of Jairus Grissom. He started the game for the Cardinals, had a pretty good afternoon rolling. Had done a little bit in the pass game, and I think earlier in the series where he went out, he'd had a 47-yard run, and so he had amassed 98 yards on the ground already, and this was still in the first half. But we didn't see him the rest of the game. Willie Taylor came in for a brief spell, and then Michael Horo, I think, ran the offense for the bulk of the remainder of the game. And he ended up with 13 carries for 83 yards and a score. And he, threw a handful of passes. I mean, it was only 11 pass attempts total for Saginaw Valley in this one, as they just absolutely steamrolled Winona State on the ground, to the tune of, again, 406 yards. We talked about that a little bit on this week in D2 football earlier on Sunday night. So, I think this is a game where if there are questions at quarterback for Saginaw Valley, certainly if Grissom's healthy enough to go, they'll give it a whirl. But if they need to be able to run the ball, they've shown that they can. They're not going to need a lot in the pass game. And if this does end up being where, hey, let's get some reps for other quarterbacks, yeah, you might see a lot of Micah Horo in this one. But I just don't see Northwood putting together the type of defense and resistance that really, I don't think it matters who's back there for Saginaw Valley this week. I think you're looking at them having a pretty good time of it. I think for Terrence Brown to have another big game is probably something that we can expect to see. Sam Dursa got some of the early carries, and I don't think we saw him much after that either. So we'll see if Tyler Amos gets a little bit more into the act in terms of the ground attack for Saginaw Valley. But again, this is one where the Cardinals are heavily favored. I think the only thing that they need to keep an eye out for is they did have 3 turnovers last week and a whole bunch of penalty yardage. So if they can clean some of that up and not give the Timberwolves a chance to stay in the game, probably going to be to their advantage. All right, and then we move into further into Saturday evening, and one of the 2 really interesting matchups for our top-rated GLIAC members. First, we've got Ferris State going on the road to take on Ashland. Now, back in the teens, and we talked about about this a little bit on Sunday night on Inside D2 Football. This used to be a pretty big rivalry. Ashland had really strong rivalries throughout the GLIAC. They had the traveling trophy that they played for against Hillsdale. Their really highly physical battles that they had with Wayne State were highly touted and regarded. And I know both those schools really looked forward, had that one circled on the calendar. Ashland's tussles with Indianapolis were really well documented. And of course, they had a lot of long-standing tough games against Ferris State and Grand Valley. So a renewal of this rivalry with the Bulldogs is going to be interesting from the standpoint of, I don't know exactly what we're going to get from Ashland. Obviously, we know what Ferris is going to do. They're going to come in and they're going to run the ball. They're going to get their guys in space, hit them when they can. Malik Mitchell had an okay outing this past Saturday against Mercyhurst. I think he finished 5 out of 10, or excuse me, 6 out of 11 for 126 yards and a score. Did put the ball on the deck a couple times, but again, on Inside D2 Football this week, we talked about how Ferris, plays with a certain risk tolerance, and that's just part of their style of play, and they're okay with it. So, and they've got what they need to be able to overcome that should they, run into some turnover trouble. So, I don't think we're too concerned about that. Carson Gulker had a solid game, didn't take a ton of snaps, but, was 2 for 2 on his passing attempts, and he, averaged 9 yards a pop on his carries, which were limited, but he did find the end zone a couple of times. So look, I mean, it's the usual cast of characters for Ferris offensively. I don't think there's really a whole lot that's noteworthy with that. They're going to go down to Ashland. They're going to put some yards up, and they're going to put some points up. So the question becomes really from there, can Ashland keep up? Now, they did have a pretty decent showing at face value against IUP last week, hanging in there and only losing 24-17, and actually having an early fourth quarter lead in that game against the Crimson Hawks. But boy, when you take a closer inspection of that game, I don't know that it went so well for Ashland. And the reality, we talked earlier here in the segment about how Northwood only had 190 yards of total offense last week. Ashland only had 190 yards of total offense last week. So they didn't really do all that much on offense, and 10 of their points came on a pair of drives that were both a yard apiece. So, they had a blocked punt that gave them a super short field, and then off an interception late in the game got a field goal. So, I mean, basically there were some special teams gaffes by IUP that helped set up Ashland with some short fields. And if you really look at it for the duration of that game, again, 190 yards of total offense, only 11 first downs. Ashland really didn't move the ball very well. So with what Ferris State brings to the table in terms of their defensive front, what they've got on the back end of their defense, and how well they really shut down Mercyhurst throughout the bulk of that game, despite Mercyhurst having the ball for half of the first quarter. I just, hey, look, again, maybe Ashland makes their big jump forward. And you see maybe a little bit more flash from the Larry Martins and Giovanni Washingtons. Again, you can't overlook the fact that they've got those two really good backs. And there's actually even, a Ferris transfer in Des Libertas who's playing wideout for Ashland. So, some of those guys are going to have some real impetus to step up their game. But after what we saw last week, boy, it's hard to think that Ashland's going to have enough potency here to really keep this game close for a long time. So this should be Ferris in a typical Ferris-style victory. And then on Saturday night, the final game of the week has Grand Valley State completing their tour of the RMAC that they had last year, coming off their 31-28 loss in Golden to Colorado School of Mines last week in a hard-fought game that saw Grand Valley show flashes of brilliance early, and then they really struggled through the better part of the middle part of that game and saw their 7-0 lead deteriorate into a 28-7 deficit. That a furious fourth quarter scramble saw them tie the game at 28, but then lose on a last second field goal to the Ore Diggers. So obviously not a ton of shame in losing to a fellow top 5 opponent, especially one that brings back as much talent as they did from their team last year, and included the reigning Harlan Hill winner in John Matoka. But that's not really the type of outing that the Lakers were looking for. So they're going to look to get themselves on the right side of things here against CSU Pueblo here in week 2. And last year we saw in these two games, again, it was the same start for Grand Valley, a very hard fought, kind of an instant classic type game against Colorado Mines. And then a week 2 installment against Pueblo. And Pueblo did the same thing this year that they did last year, kind of roughed up Midwestern State. And this year, Pueblo does have a little bit more at quarterback in Chance Fuller, the Fort Hays State transfer, who was a multi-year starter for Fort Hays, and obviously played in that MIAA, that high level of ball that they play down in that conference. So he had a nice game in his first start for Pueblo in this one, throwing for 276 and 3 scores. But what we saw last year seemed to look similar this year, just when you watch some of the line play for Pueblo against Midwestern State. On both sides of the ball, offensive and defensive lines, they just don't have quite the same caliber as what Mines does, and that kind of showed itself last year too. So after that tough opener that Grand Valley had against Mines, they went out to Pueblo and really ran the ball with a high level of efficiency, and really caused a lot of problems in the pass game for Pueblo. They weren't able to get much going. Grand Valley's defensive front did a good job of getting pressure and then stuffing the run as well. And those are things that they didn't do so well against Mines this past week. So I know that they felt like they probably didn't play as well as they could have, and they'd love to see what they could do to actually put the type of a performance together this week that they know that they're capable of. So this is one where we kind of like Grand Valley probably to have the favorite here. I think Pueblo is going to come in with a chip on their shoulder. They think that they underperformed in that home date last year between these two teams. But again, I think keeping Chance Fuller upright is going to be the real challenge for Pueblo in this one. So that's going to be their job number one, and then seeing what they can do to slow down the Grand Valley ground game, which I don't know. My hunch tells me that the Lakers will run the ball a lot more effectively this week than they did last. I mean, when Tariq Reed only goes 7 carries for 4 yards, boy, that is just not the typical output that you're used to seeing from Grand Valley in the ground game. Cade Peterson did run for 64 yards net after you factor in his sack, so he had a decent total, but a lot of that was on scrambles and things where things broke down in the pass game. So I think you're going to see a renewed focus for Grand Valley on the run, just because they know that they want to get that established and keep that offensive line moving forward. And obviously, they'll sprinkle in the passes they need to. Cody Tierney had a great game at Mines last week, so you look to see him staying involved. But ultimately, I just think the defensive and offensive fronts are going to be the story in this game, and the Lakers showed that they had a pretty big advantage at Pueblo last year. So unless there's a massive shift that's happened for both teams, I think that you're going to see that same advantage play out in this one. So we look for the Lakers to get on the right side of things and give the GLIAC another victory here this week. So that's it, guys. That's our look at week 2. 7 games on tilt. Everybody's in action, and everybody's got interesting matchups and should have a good chance for the GLIAC to put together a really good result here in terms of wins and losses. So, and my apologies to Sam Hinney up at Tech for not being able to draw on his name. I'm an old guy with a lot of stuff around his dome, so I just don't have the recall that I used to. So my apologies to Husky fans everywhere and to Sam and his family for not being able to pull his name out of a hat earlier in the broadcast. But again, good luck to all the GLIAC teams this week, and we will see you next week for the next installment of the GLIAC Football Podcast on D2Football.com.